The pen hovered over the signature line, as if the whole room were holding its breath. Light from the conference table lamp slid along the horned nib and pooled on the legal paper. An elegant, doomed script, titled Preliminary Resolution, Chapter Filing Recommendation. Howard Pierce's hand trembled an inch above the page. Outside the glass walls, the city glittered indifferent and infinite. Inside, on the 50th floor, the fate of 3,000 paychecks and a foundation scholarship program waited on a stroke. Down on the 22nd floor, in a cramped office with a radiator that clanked like a tired heartbeat, Dennis Walsh smelled cheap coffee and warm plastic. A lamp threw a circle of light over his desk. The glow picked out a child's drawing taped to the cubicle wall, a stick figure with a crooked smile labeled Dad in Caleb's uneven letters. Beside it, his mug proclaimed in a font he'd never bothered to change, World's Okayest Dad. Dennis had been awake so long that the edges of his vision had the soft shimmer of someone living on the frayed edge of 2 shifts. He had been at this desk all night because that was what you did when your son's scholarship could not be taken for granted, when the bills were one wrong month away from becoming an avalanche. He had worked the day shift and the night audit to cover the gap. He was 38, lithe from constant movement, with a face that smiled easily but rested serious. His hands had the small calluses of a man who kept counting things until the world made sense. He had not meant to touch those papers. They were part of the archive he was reconciling, a tangle of old filings and drafts that got rotated into the night pile when legal and finance wrangled over words. He was supposed to be reconciling petty invoices, matching routing prefixes and closing ledger months. Instead, a draft file landed under his hand like a stone. Inside the folder, a preliminary bankruptcy recommendation, annotated in the margins with corporate speak about liquidity stress and contingency wind-down. The document referenced employees by headcount and alluded to severance projections. It was a thing meant to be drafted behind closed doors and then combed by teams of people with title-heavy email signatures. It was not the sort of thing to be misfiled. And yet here it was, a ghost among the municipal bills and vendor reconciliation reports. Dennis's first thought was of Howard Pierce. He had watched a PBS profile a year earlier on a bus, Howard's face on the screen like a granite dawn, honed, private, expensive. The thought came not as reverence but as a practical calculation. If that signing happened, Pierce Industries would move toward a filing that could cascade into layoffs, into the end of scholarships that paid for Caleb's after-school program, and possibly into the closure of the foundation that awarded those small vital grants.
For Dennis, foundation meant one thing, a certificate boyishly framed on a wall in a one-bedroom apartment. It meant Caleb's name in a list of beneficiaries. It meant the difference between sleeping in the same bed and moving his son to a shelter. He flipped pages with gloves of fatigue. Somewhere inside the draft, a transaction log had been clipped. It was routine ledger stuff at first, dates, amounts, recipient IDs, until one line sat up like a live thing. $47,000, 15th of the month. Then on another page, the same amount, the same 15th, 2 months earlier. And again, earlier, a repeating pattern like the tick, some hidden metronome. Dennis had reconciled hundreds of records. He had rooted out duplicate billing codes where vendors tried to slip an extra $500. He had chased down missing line items that mercilessly turned profit columns into pragmatic shame. But a recurring $47,000 transfer through months of old ledgers felt different. Not an accounting error, not a vendor misread. Someone had moved money that big regularly, and the destination tag looked wrong. He pulled at the routing prefix, B212, instead of the usual B2212 that marked internal grants and foundation transfers. Routing prefixes were the way the system spoke, a shorthand of department, destination, and intent. A wrong prefix could mean a misdirected payment, a lazy data entry. It could also be a sleight of hand. Dennis rubbed his thumb over the number until the pad of his thumb blurred it. His mind, trained on numbers like a dog trained on voice commands, began to look for pattern rather than meaning. The timestamps were his next clue. Access logs sweaty and honest in their timestamps. The transfers matched logins not from the foundation's admin account, but from an executive credentials token commonly assigned to the CFO. The entries had been made during hours when the CFO was recorded in his office, according to the building's proximity logs, but the access method read as if it had been routed through a different terminal. The routing prefix mismatch suggested the funds were tagged by mistake. Dennis did not imagine himself as a hero. He imagined himself as a father who could not stand by while an error with that $47,000 figure gnawed at children's lunches and therapy appointments. He knew enough to know that one piece did not prove conspiracy. What he did know was that the pattern needed to be questioned, and it needed to be questioned now. He pulled up the reconciliation terminal and cross-checked the database fields he'd been trained to trust. The system generated rows in the cool syntax of corporate life. His fingers hovered only because he was tired of watching digits slip through reality. He traced the monthly entries back a year. 11 occurrences. 11 months in a row.
Each was flagged with the same prefix error and attached to a user token that, in the corporate world, belonged to Trevor Blackwell, the CFO whose office was a floor up and a suite of mahogany and private assistants away. Trevor's initials were on 1,000 documents, on the plaque outside his office, on the investor notes. He was an animal of numbers and a man who carried a suit like second skin. Dennis wanted to throw the file in the shredder, to reshelve it and forget both the draft and the quiet burning suspicion it planted. He had seen men fall and saw no good in being the instrument of anyone's ruin. But he also saw Caleb's scholarship certificate balanced against the lamp, the handwriting of a different kind of poverty, a single gap between what he had and what was needed. He printed the relevant pages at 2:18 a.m., watching the machine cough out evidence like a reluctant confessor. The printout smelled of toner and old paper. He folded the pages into a thick stack, counted them with the same slow fingers that had counted pocket change when the rent was an angry thing, and slid them into his messenger bag. The walk to the elevator was long in the pulse of the building. The security desk had a man in a navy sweater who kept the night's gate with bred professional apathy. He glanced at Dennis without recognition. Dennis had no authority to bring this to a boardroom. He was, on paper, junior. He was the kind of person who annotated and double-checked, and sometimes stayed later than someone with a title because he believed the file deserved quieter patience. He had meant to flag it to his supervisor the next morning, but the draft's date, tentative board review, today, 10 a.m., stitched his chest with urgency that felt almost physical. He thought of showing the printouts to Margaret Chen. Margaret saw the world in margins and math. She could read a ledger like someone read a map. Margaret believed in the craft of finance the way a good gardener believed in compost, the unseen, the careful turning. She was the person who could translate a pattern into consequence without melodrama. He had watched her at a Friday all-hands hand-wave a sloppy motion into a proper, exact question. Her colleagues deferred to her because she had a way of making the numbers be human. His path upstairs, mapped in his head like a subway line, intersected with Randy Foster just outside the timekeeping room. Randy was his supervisor and a man who mistook certainty of role for moral high ground. Randy liked to maintain department hierarchy like a family crest, clean, unquestioned, and frequently unfair. Randy had the kind of laugh that made you feel small. He had preferred Dennis to be perpetually settled in his assigned patch of night because stability in roles made oversight easier. Randy's face was already expectant when Dennis approached, as though the supervisor had been waiting for an opportunity to assign blame. "You're not on story," Randy said. His voice had the flattened edge of someone who managed his world by the strict geometry of who belonged where. "What are you doing down on the nightstack?" Dennis held the printouts like a shield and felt very small. The lamp on his desk was already a meter away in the night. "I found a misfile," Dennis said. His voice was a steady thing he needed to hold together. "There's a draft bankruptcy filing in the archives. There's a recurring transfer, 47,000, tagged wrong. Routing prefix doesn't match. It looks like it was routed with a CFO token instead of foundation code." Randy's laugh was quick and dismissive. "You pulled the preliminary legal recommendation? Dennis, you know better than to touch." "It was in the archive pile," Dennis interrupted. "It was tagged for reconciliation. That entry repeats. The prefix—" Randy's face hardened. "You don't take legal drafts upstairs. That's not your lane. You flag who needs to see it. You don't go running to the 55th floor waving printouts like a whistleblowing intern." He meant it as a dismissal, but what it delivered was a thin kind of threat. Dennis could feel his nights and wages and the fragile gravity of his son's scholarship, everything he'd held together with small certainties, shivering like a spoon in a sink. Dennis should have gone home then. He could have slept and passed the problem to morning staff. But the idea of the pen in the conference room touching that paper at 10 a.m. stayed like a burr under the skin. The pattern of $47,000 surfacing again and again had a malignancy to it that the corporate routine could not tolerate if it went unexamined. A mistake that big did not happen by omission. Someone had to trace it. He took a breath. "Can you let me show Margaret?" he asked. "Margaret?" Randy's eyebrows arch. The name was to him a liability. "Look, Dennis, if it isn't in your assigned protocol, you step back, let the process handle it." The word process hung in the air like an authority that supposed itself beyond challenge. Dennis thought of processes as useful and terrible,
useful because they prevented chaos, terrible when they bulldozed human need under form. He thought of Caleb's crooked smile and the scholarship certificate propped against the picture frame, and of nights counting change into jars until the sound of coins became prayer. "Margaret knows financial patterns," Dennis said. "She'll see if it's a misfile or something worse." Randy's gaze sharpened. "If you go stirring and it turns out nothing, that's your career. You understand that?" Dennis did. He also understood that if he did not act and that pen touched that paper, a different kind of consequence would fall. Less his own, more the thousands the draft implied. His options were ugly. Keep the printouts in his bag and sleep on them like a man who hoarded bread, hand them to Randy and trust the process, escalate beyond the chain and risk being fired for insubordination.
He felt like someone who had to choose between the immediate safe option and a moral hazard weighted with other people's lives. He looked at Randy and the man's world of neat cubicles and department colors and felt something inside him widen. He was tired of being small in moments that demanded largeness. The night had taught him the discipline of marginal gains. The ledger had taught him the honor of small details. It had also taught him the courage to get something right for Caleb. "Let me show Margaret," Dennis said again, more steadily. "If she thinks it's nothing, I step back. If she thinks it's real, then we escalate the right way." Randy stared at him as if weighing a minor gamble. He opened his mouth and then closed it. "You drag anyone up to the 50th floor, Dennis, and if there's fallout, you'll be the one fielding complaints. Don't expect me to—" "She's a senior analyst," Dennis said. "She'll know the difference between an input error and a pattern." Randy's silence was a thin, oral thing that meant denial and friction. He pointed a finger toward Margaret's cubicle and let the matter slide like a stone off ice. Margaret's desk smelled faintly of green tea. Her stacks of spreadsheets created a narrow canyon she moved through with easy, unspectacular authority. She looked up when Dennis arrived with the printouts and tilted her head to read him like he was an unfamiliar ledger. He told the story quickly and without melodrama. The misfiled draft, the recurring $47,000, the routing prefix mismatch, and the timestamps attached to an executive token. Margaret's face, near the corner of her mouth, always had a slight crease that meant she considered the world too carefully to slap a ready judgment on anything. She read the pages and clicked her tongue in the small way people do when a pattern becomes a problem. "This is strange," she said quietly, and the words were permission. "Show me the system logs you pulled." Dennis set the laptop between them and keyed in the 2 or 3 screens he was gathered to access. Margaret did not need all the fields. She needed the bones: dates, amounts, prefix, user token, access timestamps. She lifted the numbers and let them sit in her mouth. "You're sure you didn't misread the prefix?" she asked. "B212 when it should be B221, Dennis said. "It's consistent across 11 entries. Margaret's fingers moved like soft machinery. She pulled up the historical user mapping and watched for the same user token across the dates. "Trevor's token does appear in the access logs," she said, "but correlation isn't causation. It could be a shared device. An assistant could have used his token, somebody with admin access, or an API mapping error." "There's more," Dennis said. He felt the slow rise of something like fear and purpose braided together. The timestamps show the entries were made with a local terminal ID that usually tags internal foundation transfers, but the prefix still reads as B212.
It's like someone retagged the transfers after the fact. Margaret's eyes narrowed. If someone retagged transfers to hide their destination, that's a different problem. Dennis felt the room tilt. He was a wave in a sea of patterns and thought suddenly he could drown in the arithmetic of who had motive and who had opportunity. He imagined Trevor's office, the expensive art, the assistant with a nervous laugh, the privacy of executive parking, things that belonged to another ecosystem of consequence. "Listen to me," Margaret said. "We don't explode this. We take it up a floor. We give the board a chance to stop whatever paper is being signed. But we do it with evidence. You have printouts. We need timestamps and a chain of administrative entries that show someone retagged funds. You didn't pull anything illegal. This is archival, Dennis. You found what you were supposed to find." Dennis felt a little of the weight drop from his shoulders. Margaret's calm gave shape to his ragged urgency. She was a person of systems and reason. She didn't have to be swept by heroism. If she was willing to move, she could translate his suspicion into a stare of escalation that would get eyes on the draft. "Give me 10 minutes to pull a fuller log," she said. "If this is as consistent as you say, we go to legal. We go to internal audit. We do not storm the 50th floor with accusations." They worked in a cramped triangle of lamplight. Dennis kept one eye on the clock. The 10 a.m. deadline in his mind burned like a hot brand. He printed more pages while Margaret ran queries he didn't have clearance to run on his machine, but that she could launch from her terminal because seniority, like money, bought access in small but decisive increments. The printer spat out more lines, access IDs, timestamps, and a faint record of a token shift. Every new page complicated the simple narrative. Margaret's voice was low and steady. "There are 11 occurrences. The same prefix mismatch repeats. The retagging, if that's what it is, happens inside the system during business hours and uses Trevor's credential token from the admin mapping. We have to assume it was done with his credentials. We do not assume malicious intent. We assume the evidence must be reviewed. Dennis folded the pages and double-checked the margins. He wanted to cry suddenly at the thought of a man's whole company, the workforce, the foundation, everything, trembling because of a sequence trapped in digits. He wanted to keep his head down and not be the story. He wanted to be the man who kept the numbers honest and came home for family dinner. "Do you know anyone on the legal side?" he asked. Margaret smiled with a softness that surprised him. "I know a handful. I can call in a favor. But we have to be careful with who sees this first. If this is Trevor's token being misused, there are personnel issues. If it's a tagging bug, it's an IT issue."
But if it's intentional misdirection, then it becomes an ethics and legal escalation. She looked at him, and for an instant the office dropped into a private, human scale. "You'll be risking your job," she said. Dennis let the sentence hang like a bell he expected to ring. He had been risking his job for some time, in the smaller ways, taking overtime, missing rare family events, making up the difference between bills and paychecks. The idea of risk became measurable. "I have to risk it," he said. "If I don't, and that pen hits that paper at 10, I can't explain to my son why we lost the apartment because of a mistake I saw and didn't speak up about." Margaret folded one of the pages, tucking a corner like a bookmark in an argument. "Let me make a few calls," she said. Her voice moved from private conversation to the cadence of someone who regularly nudged large things into alignment. "If there is even a smidge of chance this is intentional, legal will want to see it, and they will want to pull the draft of that preliminary resolution. If the board is about to sign, we keep them from signing." The idea that they could stop the signing felt absurdly like standing between two rowboats and holding them side by side. Dennis imagined the pen again. He imagined Howard Pierce's hand above the page, a single stroke divorcing 3,000 families from a paycheck. He imagined Caleb's sleeping face, the scholarship certificate like a lighter-than-air hope on the dresser, and he felt the heat of responsibility like a bruise. After an hour of quiet work, Margaret said they had enough to escalate. She told him to wait at the stairwell. She dialed with practiced discretion, her voice framing a few sentences that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with evidence chain. Minutes stretched in a hive of collected worry. They reached Howard's assistant by 6:45 a.m. The assistant's receptionist voice had the smooth chill of a person who believed privacy to be a sacrosanct currency. "Mr. Pierce is in a meeting," the assistant said, voice steady. "I can take a message. Please tell him we need a hold on anything scheduled for 10 until legal can review a document," Margaret said. "It concerns a draft that appears to have been misfiled." There was a small pause and the faint sound of typing in the background. Margaret stayed measured. "It's urgent and internal," she said. "We believe the draft raises questions that require immediate legal review." The assistant promised to leave a note. The line clicked. Margaret hung up with the practiced patience of a woman who knew that bureaucracies had pace. A small, filthy nerve of dread curled in Dennis's gut. Promises made over wire sometimes crumbled to the floor faster than one could fix them. At 8:30 a.m., Margaret's calm yielded a new practical resolution. "We need to make sure legal gets this and that the board is alerted." If the board signs unaware, stopping the dominoes will be harder. Randy, when informed briefly of their plan, showed his irritation like a man who experienced an uninvited ruffling of his tidy order. "If you go making waves," he said, "and this is nothing, you will have made enemies." Dennis said nothing. He stood and felt like the distance between the lamplit night and the glossy world above was a river he would need to cross. The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt like a suspension in physics, weight without meaning. Margaret and Dennis stood beneath a panel of brushed steel, the elevator singing a quiet hum as it ascended. Their reflections in the metal were elongated, like two men in a calm painting. Margaret had a hand on the folder. Dennis felt the stack of printouts in his bag like a list of possible futures. "We have to be clear about our posture," Margaret said. "We don't make allegations. We lay out evidence and ask questions. No grandstanding." Dennis nodded. He wiped his palms on his pants, feeling foolish for the smallness of the gesture. The elevator caught on a number of floors, opening with an indifferent bright chirp that released groups of suited people who never looked directly at one another. Each stop was a new microcosm, sales teams comparing tablets, an investment group with private laughs. The world above felt like it lived by a code Dennis wore his whole life. You did the job you were hired to do and trusted the people with titles to keep the ship upright. He had no title that would usually command a room on the 50th floor. He had a son and a mug that admitted small mediocrity and a set of evening shifts that had hardened him to the quiet math of survival. He felt both invisible and alarmingly essential.
He tried to imagine Howard's face in the conference room, the gravity that man must carry by habit. Howard would not want to be humiliated publicly. He would not want to be in a story that would besmirch the foundation his name had built. Dennis could not imagine the billionaire as a threat. He imagined the billionaire as someone who had not yet had to consider a man like him as architect of his fate. On the 47th floor, a woman in a crisp suit boarded and glanced at Dennis with the common dismissive curiosity reserved for those without the right cufflinks. She had the kind of presence that suggested she mediated crises for breakfast. Dennis tried not to fixate on the way her shoes tapped the elevator floor. On the 49th floor, the doors opened and a pair of legal associates boarded, folders under their arms like shields. They were young and efficient, and they smelled of disinfectant hand gel and the faint perfume of optimism. Dennis felt his throat tighten. Margaret leaned toward him and kept her voice low. "We present, we do not accuse. We show documents, timestamps, and the pattern. We ask for a hold.
If they refuse, we ask for temporary removal of the document from the board's packet. If they refuse, then we do internal audit. But we do not make a scene. We know enough for escalation, not for a verdict." He nodded because her plan made room for him, for his smallness. There is a peculiar dignity in being the person who shows up with a folded page of truth. It was not heroism dressed in capes. It was shoebox heroism, care and sequence and the stubbornness to count what others did not. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 50th floor. The doors parted like a curtain and revealed the foyer beyond, a clean, almost surgical space, plants with glossy leaves, and a receptionist whose badge glinted like a lighthouse. The air smelled faintly of citrus and paper. On the way to the conference wing, Dennis glimpsed the boardroom through the glass, a table long enough to seat a small army, cushions polished to no human hand. There was a man at the head of the table with a gray mane and a face that had been honed into a look of constant appraisal. Howard Pierce, perhaps not yet at the table, but somewhere in the orbit of decision. The sight of the room made Dennis's chest ache with the sense of how much power a single hand could wield. Margaret tapped the glass with the heels of her fingers once, twice, then turned and walked toward an outer office where a legal associate was already typing. Dennis followed, watching the words on the screen slither into paragraphs of controlled urgency. Legal moved with a different kind of rhythm, one that thought in clauses and contingency. They were not yet allies. They were professionals who might be convinced. A receptionist took the printouts, and someone, an assistant with a voice modulated in calm protocol, took the call. The small world of forms and minutes had begun moving like a hinge. "You did the right thing bringing this up," Margaret murmured as they stood for a moment. "It takes courage to make a small, lonely finding dangerous in a system designed to ignore it." Dennis thought of a different small thing, Caleb's right shoe, a scuff on the toe he'd promised to fix but never had the time. He thought of the note in Caleb's lunch bag that said, "Good luck on the test, Daddy." He thought of the certificate that glittered in his small apartment like a private sun. He thought of everything he put between himself and falling to make a life for someone else. "Why did you help?" Dennis asked suddenly. It wasn't a question about procedure or leverage. It was a human question about loyalty in a place that had none. Margaret smiled. "A human thing. Because someone has to notice the small things," she said. "Numbers are, in the end, people. And sometimes the people with access forget that a wrong prefix can mean a wrong life." They waited in a corridor that hummed with diffuse power. Legal interviewed with the steadiness of people who had to shield themselves from spectacle. Margaret spoke with the bluntness of a person who would rather be right than theatrical. She set the pages down and watched the legal associate flip through them, eyes moving like a person reading a map that might lead to a minefield. Dennis wanted to say more. He had a rush of words, how he had found the file among archival drafts, the way the $47,000 line looked like a heartbeat in a dying patient. He wanted to tell them about his son, sleeping with a certificate on the dresser like a promise. He wanted to be the human measure of the numbers he brought. Instead, he folded his hands and let Margaret speak. She was the translator he needed. They left the pages in good hands. Legal promised to pull a hold on any action until they reviewed. It was not approval. It was a pause. A pause could be as thin as a breath, but in the right places, a breath could be everything. As Dennis descended the elevator back toward the 22nd floor, the city had awakened into an indifferent fullness. People in tailored coats pushed past him on the sidewalk. He pulled his jacket tighter and held the stack of printouts to his chest like a small, evidence-shaped talisman. By the time he reached his apartment building, the morning light had found a way between the buildings and slanted across the cracked paint on his door. He unlocked the door with a key that had been chewed by habit. Caleb sat at the table eating cereal with exaggerated seriousness, the scholarship certificate propped against the sugar bowl like a valance of hope. He had a pencil smudged on his cheek from drawing, big, confident circles. He grinned when Dennis came in, as if his father had been gone for a week. "You're late," Caleb said, not as an accusation, but as a fact to be catalogued. He chewed and gestured toward the drawing pinned on the fridge. "I had a late meeting," Dennis said. "We talked about school stuff." Caleb's fork scraped his cereal in a rhythm Dennis recognized. Later, he would tell his son there had almost been a pen and a signature that morning. Later, he would try to explain to a child the micro-mechanics of routing prefixes and tokens, and the why of grown-up fears. For now, he poured milk and listened to Caleb describe the protagonist of his new cartoon with the gravity of a small man detailing his kingdom. They were ordinary in the way the world often confuses with smallness, not invisible, but not ostentatious. Dennis made coffee in a pot that had seen better days. The mug that claimed the okayness of his fatherhood sat warm in his hand. The scholarship certificate hung on the wall, and Caleb drew a new man with a tie and a round house, and labeled him Dad and Boss. The joke scraped Dennis's throat like a harmless blade. He drove Caleb to school and watched him jump onto the curb. The boy waved at the bus like it might be a spaceship. Dennis walked back to his car, thinking about the chain of events he'd set in motion.
He carried the brief, hot worry of a man who had put his stake in the ground and waited to see whether the earth would answer. At his desk by mid-morning, he found an email with a terse subject line: "Hold on board review, legal to examine." Someone, somewhere, had decided to stop the process. The subject line was small and bureaucratic and heroic in a way the world rarely noticed. He let himself breathe. For a few hours, life slit into manageable pieces: emails, cross-checks, and a phone call from Margaret telling him to be patient. The time stretched and then folded, and then at 2 in the afternoon, a different kind of sound arrived, a whispered commotion in the hallway. People on the floor had gathered stories like small, fevered birds. It was Randy who cornered him by the copy machine, eyes like someone who held a grudge. "I told you to stay in your lane," Randy said. "You told me to do my job," Dennis said. "I did the right thing." Randy's jaw worked. The boss was close to signing. We were trying to get ahead of a serious situation with minimal damage. You go running to legal and you make people nervous. Dennis's patience was a thin thing. He thought of Howard and of the pen and of the 1,000 people whose names he'd once seen in a company report as a handful of salaries, and then later thought of them as living rooms and Lego sets. "If we stop the signing because of an error I found," he said, "that might save thousands of people from losing their jobs. That's not making people nervous, that's acting with care." Randy exhaled and the sound was almost pity. "You're a nice nine, Manus, but you don't get to pick the fights. The world isn't interested in small revelations." Dennis wanted to say, "The world is interested in the people who show up and count what others ignore," but he did not. He walked away and felt Randy's words score him like a small, meaningless cut. He had already been cut enough. By late afternoon, legal had taken the draft into a secure review. A note on his desk said the board meeting had been delayed pending legal review. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the weight on his chest lifted like an entire roofline moving away. He allowed himself a small, private exhale. He had done his part. He had looked at a line of numbers until it made sense in a way it did not intend. The next morning, the office was a different place. The blinds upstairs were drawn. There was a low rumble of conversation that suggested the building itself was waking to news. The $47,000 motif had begun to appear in whispered conversation like a coin that clinked against the lip of a jar. People speculated without facts and built stories with faint precision. Dennis tried to keep his head down in his work study. He had acquired a habit of humility that fit into his days like a well-placed coat. Yet the knowledge that the draft had been pulled was like being on a street after a storm. The air smelled different and sharp.
The world, for now, was awake. At 11, Margaret appeared at his desk with a new set of printouts and the exact look of someone who had been viscerally pulled into the gravity of a thing she did not like. "They pulled it," she said. "Legal's holding. They're doing a more precise audit, but something else came up last night." "What?" Dennis asked. Margaret placed a single sheet on his desk. There, printed in small font and then highlighted by her pencil, was a sequence of entries that had gone unnoticed amid the shuffle of spreadsheets. The highlighted numbers repeated: $47,000. The dates lined up like marks on a calendar. The routing prefix remained wrong. But what made the hairs on the back of Dennis's neck stand up was an additional column he had missed before: approval hierarchy. Under approval hierarchy appeared a list of initials that suggested the movement of the funds had been approved by someone, and the name at the top, the one that sat like a command: bore the initials TB. Dennis felt the room tilt very slightly. Trevor Blackwell's initials, Margaret said, on the approval sequence, but not in the way we'd expect. These approvals look like an after-the-fact insertion. They're recent, stamped, and retroactive. Whoever is doing this either has Trevor's access or is retagging approvals. Dennis reread the printout until the numbers blurred. He had not expected approval motives to drift into view so quickly. The $47,000 was now an instrument of someone's personal calculus. People did not routinely insert a CFO's approval post hoc. Doing so suggested intent and method. "You sure you want to pass this up?" he asked, because some small part of him wanted to keep the evidence in his pocket like a small thing that could be lost or used at a better moment. Margaret looked at him, and she did not soften. "We pass this up. We do it with caution. We do not make dramatic public claims. We give legal the documents. We let them assess who has access and why these approvals were inserted. If it's Trevor, then internal audit will ask the board to pull him out of the process pending investigation. If it's not, we still need to find out who has been using that token to make the signature look like it's the CFO's." The word investigation felt like a blade moving across a syllable. Dennis thought of the man who owned the face in the evening news pieces, a man with a foundation and a name on a scholarship. He did not know whether Howard would be grateful or enraged. He only knew that he had set in motion a sequence beyond his comfortable stewardship. They compiled the evidence. Margaret added an annotated timeline. Dennis cataloged the entries, the prefix mismatches, the access timestamps, and the retroactive approvals. He labeled each page with the quiet precision of someone who knew the weight of evidence. When they left the legal office, Margaret said one thing: "If this is a mistake, it will be corrected.
If it's malicious, we need to ensure no one can hide it." Dennis drove to the small market to buy milk and a cheap bouquet of carnations because Caleb liked them, and because small rituals mattered. He thought on the drive of how the world lives on small gestures, unseen by the people who make the headlines. He thought of his son sleeping with the scholarship certificate like a quiet, incandescent promise on the dresser. That night he sat alone in front of his lamp and counted the pages again. He watched the numbers be human and the human be numbers. He thought of the pen in a boardroom above him, and he thought of the way one person's attention could be a thin, shining thing that made other people's lives whole. He slept badly, fingers still sticky with toner. The next day, the building thrummed with a different energy. Security sweeps had been increased. There were people with clarified purpose, and men and women in plain suits who carried the look of people who were accustomed to stopping trouble. Reporters had not yet arrived. The story had not become a spectacle, but the rumor mill had found a taste and fed on it. Around 9, a terse announcement went over the internal system. Temporary hold placed on scheduled board actions, a reminder that all internal communications were to remain confidential. Dennis noticed how language could be wielded to smooth panic into decorum. The hold meant time. Time meant the difference between a pen touching paper and a pen left poised. But time carried dangers of its own. Small, malevolent actors could burrow into the spaces a pause left and reconfigure them to their ends. Dennis had been awake while the drafts shuffled. He had watched patterns form like mold in damp glass. He did not know how to trust the slow, procedural work of a firm to root out a pattern that might have been nurtured by someone with access and a motive. At 9:47 a.m., an email arrived in Dennis's inbox with a subject line that made his chest buzz like a struck wire. Request for immediate verification, unusual transaction routing. The sender was from internal audit. The message asked Dennis and Margaret to confirm a handful of flagged entries to confirm. They wanted the basics: dates, amounts, routing prefixes, and whether the entries matched the authorization records. The email was polite and brisk. It smelled of procedural caution. Dennis read it once, then twice. His fingers hovered over the keyboard like a man steadying himself before cold water. He answered with the care of someone who knew how a comma could become a sentence. He attached the printouts, the annotated timeline Margaret had helped him compile, and a quiet note. Found in archival reconciliation. 11 instances. Same amount, same 15th. Prefix mismatch. Requesting review. He hit send and felt the small, brittle relief of doing the right thing in the right order. Internal audit moved with the slowness of a winter river, patient, precise.
They requested to speak with Dennis and Margaret that morning in a small conference room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and a lifetime of clipped voices. A woman named Claire led the review. She had hair pulled into a practical knot and the visor of someone accustomed to parsing inconvenient truths. "We'll need you both to walk us through how you found this," Claire said, eyes steady as a scalpel. "We'll then have IT review system logs and compliance review authorization strings. We will discreetly pull the draft from the board packet and pause any action pending a finding. Thank you for flagging this." Dennis felt Margaret's hand brush the back of his shoulder in the kindest furtive way. "You did the right thing," she said again. The repetition sounded like an oath. That afternoon, their small review became a larger one. IT produced a neutral-sounding report that read like a slow collapse, timestamp sequences, terminal IDs, and a pattern of retroactive approvals written into the audit trail after the transfers posted. The report relied on harmless, believable language, manual override entries, post hoc authorization, but the meaning was sharp. Each $47,000 transfer had been tagged, retagged, approved in a sequence that bent the expected flow of approvals into something that read like afterthoughts, and the approval signatures bore the mapping of an executive token assigned to Trevor Blackwell. The phrase "Trevor's token" seemed small and then enormous as it moved through the room. It did not by itself prove malfeasance. Credentials could be misused, stolen, or shared. Assistants sometimes had delegated access. Software glitches sometimes rewrote fields. The audit team knew these caveats. They also knew that 11 occurrences over 11 months were not a fluke. Pattern in this business spoke louder than a single anomalous line. Legal asked for a secure session with the board chair. The paper-marked "temporary hold board packet" hung like a flag across the agenda. The draft that had been poised for a signature at 10 that morning remained off the table. For now, paper did not become fate. News that a hold had been placed seeped through the building in the way rumors always do, slow then sharp. Elevator conversation shortened. People who had pretended not to watch each other's faces found themselves glancing up at the blinds as if they might see something through the slats. The 51st floor, the executive lounge, smelled of espresso and private calls. Howard Pierce remained unlisted on Dennis's schedule of concerns until legal asked to see him. Howard arrived to the review with the expression of someone unfamiliarly awake. The man who had been a granite image on a documentary screen now stepped into the human scale of being addressed directly about the company he had built. He was not theatrical, he wore discretion like a coat.
He greeted Margaret with a nod and looked at Dennis with a curiosity that was almost shy. "You've been awake all night?" Howard asked quietly when they met in the briefing room. Dennis felt his cheeks flush. "Just late, reconciling archives." Howard's eyes softened in a way that made Dennis uncomfortably human. "Thank you," he said, and the syllable held more than corporate obligation. No one should be staying awake for someone else's paychecks. The meeting with legal and internal audit arranged itself into formal steps. Claire explained the findings. Margaret stood beside Dennis, not as an escort, but as someone who had read the pattern and decided it deserved a voice. Dennis laid the timeline on the table, the first $47,000 entry, the repeating 15th, the B212 prefix, and the way each entry had been retroactively approved under Trevor's credentials. Trevor Blackwell was called down from his office with a calm that only thickened the room. He arrived with his tie slightly off, looking by degrees unsettled. He greeted Howard with a clipped professionalism and then stood, hands folded, as the audit team presented. "Mr. Blackwell," the lead counsel said, "we need to understand these entries. We're seeing an 11-month sequence of recurring transfers, each for $47,000, each retagged post-entry with what appears to be your executive token. Can you help us explain?" Trevor's first response was practical. "Those entries are charity and grant disbursements in part," he began. He sounded like a man rehearsed in plausible pathways. "We have multiple vehicles for transfers. The system occasionally requires adjustments." "We're not asking about the transfers themselves," Claire said, precise. "We're asking about the sequence. Repeated amounts on the same day of the month, a prefix mismatch consistent across entries, and retroactive approval entries tied to your credential token. We need to know who authorized these adjustments." Trevor's jaw moved. He glanced at Howard, then at legal. "I sign off on many items," he said. "There are delegated authorities. Assistants can act in my name. I'm not aware of—" Margaret cut in, not unkindly. "Mr. Blackwell, the terminal IDs linked to these entries do not match the usual terminals used by your office. They match foundation processing stations. That suggests the transfers were retagged after posting to disguise the destination." Trevor's face tightened. He tried to smile. It was not an easy smile. "A glitch," he said, voice thinner. "A mapping error. We have automated processes. Sometimes fields overwrite incorrectly." The legal team asked for the system's operations logs, the terminal mapping history, and anything showing who had access to Trevor's token. IT was quick and careful. It produced a trace that showed user token assignments and the devices that had interacted with those tokens at the times in question.
The trace was technical. but not arcane. It was the kind of plain map auditors live by. One by one, the pieces clustered like birds in flight. The terminal IDs did not belong to Trevor's executive office. They belonged to a departmental workstation used by someone in finance support, doors away from Randy's team. The access timestamps often coincided with times when Trevor's badge had recorded presence in his office. That meant two possibilities. Either Trevor's credentials were used remotely by an assistant while he was in the office, or his credentials were being used without his direct involvement to sanitize entries. The room thinned with the quiet of understanding. Howard folded his hands. His pen never found the paper he'd paced earlier. Dennis felt the old pen in the boardroom like a ghost, hovering above a decision not yet made. Trevor's composure began to leak. He balanced on the knife edge that exists for men whose authority is their currency. Pride makes poor shelter when the audit trail speaks. "I've had some personal matters," he said finally, too quickly. "Debt, investments that went sideways." His voice was small and human. "But I would never jeopardize the company. If adjustments were made, they were to correct misallocations. I don't believe—" "You used your credential," Claire interrupted evenly. "The logs show your token appearing." She slid a page toward him. The evidence was not dramatic. It was clinical. A string of timestamps that aligned with approvals and the retagging sequence, 11 small motions that together had the shape of intent. Trevor inhaled and then held his breath. His face flushed. He made sentences that tried to make light of small mistakes. But as the legal team pressed on the chain, who had the admin rights, who could post retroactive approvals, whether those approvals had required multi-factor reauthorization, his words began to thin into fragments. He tried to point at an assistant. He tried to say the system was loose. He tried like a gambler in a losing hand to trade bluster for logic. At one point, Trevor's voice broke. He admitted to covering some shortfalls in a way that suggested personal exposure. He did not, because of counsel and because of the legal terms hovering in the room, confess to criminal intent. He spoke in the language of a man pressed between the ledger and life. "But nobody authorized fraud," he said. "I was trying to manage a short-term liquidity issue. I made transfers, all right? I authorized reclassification to keep things afloat for a moment." The legal counsel closed a folder and removed upstream language about assuming innocence. They spoke instead of removal from duties pending investigation. That phrasing did what phrasing must do in crises. It created distance, protection, and order. Howard listened with a look that suggested both disappointment and the practical weight of a man who knew his company could not afford improvised accounting.
Trevor's office emptied as security politely escorted him to a private room. The word traveled down corridors like a current. Removed pending investigation. The SEC was notified as a matter of process. The company would cooperate fully, legal said, in the same breath as corporate PR prepared statements. An initial arrest was not the rhetorical forecast. A formal review and possible charges were. That was enough to make the news cycle begin to organize itself around a single name. For Dennis, the confirmation was both relief and a kind of grief. Relief because the pattern he had noticed had not been a fluke. Grief because a man who had been the face of his company to investors and employees sat now in possibility of ruin. The human cost of corporate crime is not neat. It is messy and painful and slow. Outside the secure rooms, talk gathered speed. People who had once taken the elevator with Trevor now whispered as if in a church. Emails went in turmoil. The $47,000 motif that had been a piece of paper in his bag now had a life. Someone on the 50th floor muttered it under their breath like a benediction and a curse. Howard asked to see Dennis alone before a PR statement. They stood in a narrow corridor lined with modern art that had the precise chill of public taste. Howard's face was not triumphant. It was weary and very real. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. He sounded like someone amazed by goodness. "You could have let the board sign. You could have kept your life the way it was." Dennis's first instinct was to deny the centerfold attention. He wanted to retreat to his lamplit desk and the small, ordinary acts of parenting that felt safer than headlines. "I couldn't," he said simply. "I saw a pattern. I filed it the way I'm supposed to." Howard gave him a small smile that was almost brotherly. "You saved this company from catastrophic decisions," he said. The gravity of those words landed like a soft, heavy hand. "More than that, thousands of people have paychecks because you noticed a prefix and insisted on following it." Dennis wanted to refuse accolades. He accepted a brief, awkward handshake and then left. People lined the hallways.
their faces part curiosity, part gratitude. Faces that were, in the end, the same lines of ordinary people Dennis had imagined when he first saw the draft. He thought of Caleb and the scholarship certificate, and how small things accumulate into shelter. The press, when it finally smelled scent of a story, prepared the narration. The company released a brief statement. Temporary hold placed on board actions pending internal review. Senior executive removed pending investigation. Cooperation with regulators. It was the kind of language intended to hold a narrative open. It was also the kind of language that demanded time. Time is a strange currency. It costs the hopeful patience of employees and buys the company a chance to do the heavy work of cleaning house.
Over the next few weeks, auditors combed records with a granular patience that made Dennis both proud and exhausted. He answered questions, he walked through his steps a dozen times. He did not seek the spotlight. He accepted interviews only insofar as legal allowed and PR coordinated. His reward, if it could be called that, was the absence of a pen poised on a signature line and the knowledge that the hold had prevented immediate damage. The SEC opened a preliminary inquiry. Their letters were formal, precise, and contained the careful restraint of an institution that must prove before it pronounces. Investigators asked for documents, statements, and a timeline. They took statements from people around Trevor, the assistants, the support staff, the IT team. Trevor was placed on administrative leave and barred from the systems pending the inquiry. His removal was not a sentence, it was process, but for the employees and for Dennis, it felt momentous. Eventually, the investigation produced a tidy architecture of culpability sufficient for the SEC to file charges related to misappropriation and falsified approvals. The company's counsel asserted full cooperation and emphasized that charges were allegations pending adjudication. Trevor was escorted from the building under a polite but firm security watch. The image repelled and satisfied in equal measure. A man whose role had insulated him from many things, now stripped of the dignity that title had given. Dennis watched from the stairwell as Trevor's box of personal items left the office. It felt surreal, an aftermath as tidy and as devastating as any he had seen in newspaper pages. In a statement a month after the hold, Howard addressed the company and then the public. He was modest, unshowy. He said what leaders sometimes must say in the face of betrayal: gratitude to those who had stood for truth, commitment to systemic reform, and sorrow for any pain caused by actions that violated trust. He praised the internal teams who had acted swiftly and, without naming Dennis in the headline, gave credit to the quiet diligence that saved the company from a hasty signature and possibly worse. When the board reconvened, they did so with new procedures. Multi-tiered approvals, an extra check on foundation transfers, and tighter access controls were instituted. The company announced an independent review of internal controls and a reorganization of oversight for the foundation. It was not theatrical, it was paperwork and discipline, but for the thousands of employees who might have lost their jobs, it mattered. For the families who relied on paychecks, it was, in very real terms, shelter. Howard arranged a small meeting in a private office with a meeting that felt neither grand nor public. He brought a modest envelope, symbolic, and a more practical letter. He offered Dennis a promotion to a role that formally put his attention to detail where it could protect the company, rather than risk being overlooked.
He offered compensation for lost time and the ability to ensure Caleb's scholarship would be secured. He also offered a quiet line of credit to address any immediate housing issues Dennis might have. Dennis, who had never imagined himself comfortable in language of reward, hesitated. Pride is a funny thing for people who have learned humility by necessity. He accepted the promotion with a small private smile, asking only that the transition be sensible and not splinter his hours with Caleb. Howard nodded, understanding that the man who found the problem had a life outside the ledger that mattered more than the ledger itself. Randy, when he learned of the outcome, approached Dennis like a man coming to terms with the world. There was a roughness to Randy's apology that made it credible. He admitted his mistake, the tendency to police lanes rather than recognize the lane crossing that matters when a life is at stake. He offered a handshake and, more importantly, offered to be a conduit rather than a blockade in Dennis's new role. Margaret received neither a bonus nor a press release. She returned to her desk with the same quiet competence, the way she moved through spreadsheets unchanged, but thinner with satisfaction. She and Dennis shared a coffee in the cramped break room, neither of them wanting to make much of what had happened. The world had a way of wanting spectacle, and they had, instead, a ledger and a child's scholarship. That suited them just fine. The company announced in a low-key statement that the Pierce Foundation would expand its scholarship program by a modest but meaningful percentage.
Howard had asked for the foundation's trustees to consider increasing its award pool in light of the company's renewed commitment to integrity. He said publicly what he told Dennis privately: those scholarships mattered because they were small suns in rooms where children slept. For Dennis, life did not become a glossy montage of triumph. The promotion gave him a steadier paycheck and a predictable schedule. He found a slightly larger apartment with sunlight that reached the back bedroom and a closet that did not house his son's clothes in piles. He bought a small second-hand couch and a replacement coffee pot that did not leak. He picked up Caleb each afternoon and had time, finally, to order a pizza on a Friday without counting the slice-and-second arithmetic practice. Caleb noticed the change in little things. The walk to school was less rushed. Dinner had more variety. The scholarship certificate still hung on the wall, but now it was flanked by a fresh drawing of a man wearing a tie labeled Dad at Work. Dennis kept that drawing behind the television like a talisman. Media attention came in measured waves. Reporters called Howard's office for comment and then asked for comment from employees. Dennis declined most requests. He told a single careful interview through HR where he said that he had simply done his job.
He did not want the story to overshadow the people whose jobs had been saved. He wanted the focus to be on the process that allowed a mistake to be caught and corrected. The public reaction was varied. Some hailed the story as a triumph of one man's vigilance. Others framed it as another cautionary note about corporate power. The company weathered the storm with remedy rather than denial. The SEC's charges languished through months of legal proceedings. That was the way of the law, slow, deliberate, and exacting. Trevor's fate would be decided by courts and counsel, not by newsroom headlines. Inside the small private victories, Dennis built a life out of small, steady materials. He bought new sheets for Caleb's bed. He let the boy pick a poster for the living room, a rocket ship in bright cobalt. On a Saturday morning, he watched Caleb do homework at the kitchen table with a mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad," steaming nearby. There was a quiet pride that had nothing to do with corporation statements and everything to do with the little man drawing a big house and writing "Dad and Boss." One evening, after a long day of work and a pizza eaten without counting slices, Dennis sat on the edge of Caleb's bed. The boy was already half asleep, a small breath like a bell. Dennis traced the scholarship certificate with his finger, then looked at the drawing taped to the wall. He had, in the months since, learned how fragile institutions were and how sturdy the small, precise acts of people could be. He had learned that the right attention, even from someone without power, could redirect storms. He thought of the pen he had almost witnessed touch paper, and how, because of a wrong prefix and a tired man who noticed it, thousands of lives were quieter than they would have been. He thought about the moral geometry of it, that integrity is often a thing stitched from habits, turning pages, counting lines, insisting on a question when the answer seems plausible. He had been a single father who could not afford to be romantic about heroism. He had to be practical. Practicality, he learned, is often indistinguishable from courage. The $47,000 figure remained a tiny monument in conversation and in his memory. He would sometimes see it in mundane places: the restaurant bill for a celebratory dinner, the last 4 digits of a new office number, a scribble on a post-it. It no longer had the malignity it had carried that first night. It had the worn, quiet shape of a lesson. Months later, when the company announced new oversight protocols and the foundation announced an expanded award pool, Howard wrote a short note to the staff acknowledging the work of internal teams and naming the importance of individual vigilance. Dennis received an email letting him know that the foundation had chosen to honor Caleb's cohort with increased funding. No spotlight, just a gesture that meant the boys' after-school program would continue without fear of abrupt interruption.
On a humid spring night, Dennis watched Caleb sleep. The apartment hummed with the soft noise of a radiator and the distant city. Dennis held the small brace of a handled trophy Howard had given the team, a modest plaque that read, "Thank you for integrity," and placed it on the shelf next to the scholarship certificate and the drawing. He did not put it front and center. He put it where it would be seen when needed, as a reminder rather than an altar. He poured coffee into the "World's Okayest Dad" mug and sat down at the tiny kitchen table. For a long time he simply listened. The soft breathing of a child, the distant hum of traffic, the refrigerator's quiet click. He thought of how many times small observations made the difference between catastrophe and continuity. He thought of the possibility that courage is not a thunderous thing, but a small, patient persistence. Outside, a pen would be poised in other rooms, and other people would face decisions that could topple or save. Not all of them would be noticed.
not all of them would have someone like Dennis in the archive room on a night shift. But that did not undermine the moral that had become, by then, an almost simple belief. Details matter. People who pay attention, who keep counting when counting seems thankless, are the kind of people who can tilt the scales. In the quiet, Dennis smiled at the small absurdity of it. A wrong routing prefix, 11 transfers, a number, $47,000, repeating until someone listened. A single dad who was paying attention to the life his son might have. That was all it had taken. He rose and straightened the certificate on the wall, smoothed the corner of Caleb's drawing, and then climbed the narrow staircase to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched his son breathe. He thought of the months ahead, less fragile now, but never certain, and felt for the first time in a long while a small, sustained peace. If someone asked him later what had saved Howard Pierce's company from ruin, he would likely shrug and say it had been a team effort, the systems doing their work, legal and audit acting as they should. He would be right. But because stories simplify, people might remember the single detail, the pen, the wrong prefix, the $47,000 that looked like a metronome, until a man named Dennis counted it and asked a question. That night, with the lamp casting a pool of yellow on the bedside and the radiator ticking like a gentle metronome, Dennis whispered a small, private promise, less a prayer than a vow, to keep watching the margins. He turned off the light and watched the soft arc of his son's sleep. In the hush, the ordinary heroism of attending to the small things felt at last like an adequate answer to a complicated world. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear how small acts of attention can change lives, and tell us in the comments what small detail once changed your world.